Hey, what's going on, everybody? Welcome back to another episode of the Fortified Life podcast, where we are passionate about developing a dependency on Jesus in the marketplace. I'm your host, Jason Davis, aka Mr. Fortify. Every week, we have the opportunity to bring on authors, speakers, coaches, leaders, and nonprofits who are also passionate about putting God back in business. Really excited today as we have a wonderful guest who's written a great book. Let me tell you a little bit more about him. With over 40 years devoted to advancing Christian organizations, Steve Woodworth brings a wealth of experience in marketing, management, and organizational development. He steered World Vision's direct marketing and donor services through a decade of annual double-digit growth in the 1980s and 1990s. Since joining Masterworks in 1992, Steve has been instrumental in establishing it as the premier marketing agency dedicated to aiding hundreds of Christian organizations in achieving their mission. Steve also gives back as a volunteer on boards, as a convener of industry leaders, and an advisor to the CEO of Lausanne Movement. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the Fortified Life, Steve Woodworth. Steve, how's it going today?
Great. Thank you, Jason. It's good to be here.
Well, Steve, before we dive into the book, with a man of your experience, God has graced you to do many things. We know you just didn't all of the sudden get all this wisdom all in one setting. So, kind of take us on the journey a little bit. We heard in the bio, various stops, various sets of wisdom and skills, but how would you summarize your professional journey?
Well, it's definitely a God story, Jason. I thought, I became a Christian between my last years in college and wanted to go into the mission field, partly just because my wife and I both had such a radical conversion. We thought we wanted to do something that no one else probably wants to do. And so we moved to Southern California to go to Fuller to get ready for that, only to discover that we could not make enough money to pay Fuller and pay our living expenses. And so after one semester, I was having my first real crisis of faith. My pastor told me about World Vision, which was right down the road from Fuller in those days. And so I walked in the front door and filled out an application and got hired and started out doing analytics on their mainframe, their treasure trove of data that they had there that had not a lot of analysis, but a lot of data was there. And that just led one thing to another, some breakthroughs that a smart group of people would ask me questions, and I'd go try to figure out if I could get an answer out of the data, and ended up in charge of all the marketing for World Vision, which was quite an amazing ride. I mean, it just doesn't happen hardly anywhere that you stay in the same organization and go from entry level to the senior, most levels of the organization. Got to travel all over the world. It was a great experience. Left there and moved back to Seattle, and where my wife and I were from, and have been ever since then, over 30 years, helping other Christian organizations with what I learned at World Vision and then what I've learned since then. And it's been a great opportunity to have leverage in the kingdom and helping a lot of organizations.
Mm. Steve, I appreciate that breakdown and with all of your travels and also helping organizations in the way that you have, that uniquely suits you to write this book that we're going to talk about today. Your book, Lost in Transition: Lessons from the Most Disastrous and Successful Ministry Successions. Steve, I'm excited to dive into this with you. So let's go ahead and dive in, if we
All
will.
right.
Steve, in thinking about this topic, a lot of times the question comes best case, worst case scenario. But how would you describe the worst case scenario of a ministry or church failing to transition?
Well, that's part of why I wrote the book, Jason. I watched a lot of really bad successions and I had friendships with some of the CEOs that were going through them. So I was hearing real time what was happening. And over time, that gave me just a real heavy heart for leaders who are brought into situations that they aren't a good fit for, or leaders who are pushed out or not handled well as they transition out of leadership in an organization. And I began to frame some ideas about what I thought caused things to go well and things to go badly. And as I shared those with a colleague one time in an airport, he said, "You need to write a book." And I said, "Oh, I don't know. I don't have time, and I don't know that I know enough." And he had a designer in our marketing agency mock up a book cover, and it sat on my desk for 5 years before I finally thought, "Hey, maybe I should write that
Wow.
book." And it the bad ones are the ones that really gave me the most heartburn. I've
Mm,
seen places where a leader was treated badly, and you know, 10 years later, they still choke up telling the story about one leader, for example, thought he was being a really good steward. He laid out an 8-year plan for the board. He intended to groom an internal candidate. He was working on that. And 6 years into it, all of a sudden the board said, "We're ready to make the transition now." And he said, "Well, it was really important to me to finish the 8 years because that would have been my 30 years in this job." And he had grown the organization tenfold. He'd been very successful, well known in the circle of those particular types of ministries. I'm purposely not saying what it was because I don't
hmm
want to embarrass the organization, but there's a lot of stories like this. This is a particularly bad one. He asked the board why, is there anything I'm not doing well? And I don't think my successor is ready yet. And he just got pushed back from the board through the whole thing. And he just decided, I'm okay, I'm done. And his financial plan had included 2 more years of salary. So the board came back and said, okay, well, we want to make you good on the financial side. So we're going to pay you for the 2 years. And he said that doesn't make any difference at this point. He was just so hurt. It was like um, they dishonored his 28 years of service by the way they treated him those last 2 years. And his successor wasn't, as far as he could tell, advocating to get him out of there for any reason. He was still in good health. He started another ministry doing something completely different. So he didn't disparage the organization, but he also didn't support it in enthusiastic terms. And what I've seen is when CEOs are not treated well, and it happens, gosh, a significant percentage, maybe a third of the time, that CEOs are hurt as they leave a job. Yeah, they all they have to do is be lukewarm about the organization.
hmm
The donors generally, if they've been around, if this leader's been a successful leader and has been around for a while, the donors are friends. A lot of the donors are friends, and so they're giving to the organization and to the person who they believe in as a leader. And when that person is then asked, what should I continue to give? I don't know this new leader. If the person says, well, it's up to you, you just need to pray about it. That's all it takes for a donor to feel like, there's something doesn't feel right here, and then take their donations and go somewhere else. And I've seen when those leadership transitions go badly, or those are the ones I call disasters. I've seen income drop as much as 50%.
Wow.
And that is a disaster. Talk about lost momentum. I've seen really good staff people leave where there's an exodus of people who really liked the former leader and don't like what happened. And so they don't like the organization anymore. And some of the best people move on to go somewhere else. So there's a lot of that going on. You don't ever hear about it because it doesn't go public. And yet it's happening. And that's the main thing I was trying to do with the book. There's a guy named Bill High who started a donor advised fund called the Signatory, used to be a part of the National Christian Foundation.
hmm
Bill was talking to me about this book in 2023, and he said, "You've been talking about the book for a year." He said, you should make it your top priority in 2024 to finish that book." Or no, it was 2023, to finish that book in 2023, because every year you don't write that book, there's at least a few successions that could have gone well that are going to go badly. And I have had anecdotal evidence. I mean, I haven't tried to do any research or anything, but I have regularly had people come and tell me that their situation was going badly. They got the book, they got copies for their board, if that was part of the problem. They got copies for a copy for their successor, and they worked through it together. and it solved their problems because the principles are not that hard. They're just things that in our normal human and somewhat, fleshly way of approaching our work, we often just do dumb things.
Mm. Wow, Steve, I'm hearing, if I'm hearing you correctly, I kind of heard two different situations in the example that you gave where the founder was hurt. I didn't really hear celebration. They didn't honor his wishes. And man, a lot of times we don't think about 2 years. I mean, it could have been salvaged. I mean, we weren't talking about another decade. So there's the celebration piece on the way out, and then the communication, and that came out with the donor, something being off, and not because of not allowing him to see it through, and then the donors becoming, essentially distrusting, something's not right. And so, if I'm hearing you correctly, that may set up an example of what it means to a best case scenario. So, worst case, the guy said, I'm done. You're not going to let me finish. What have you seen in really good succession planning?
In really good succession planning, the person feels honored, they feel
Mm,
appreciated, they feel the time is right, they're ready to move on. They've been involved in choosing their own successor. There's a bit of overlap with the successor. Sometimes, like in the case of World Vision, Rich Stearns is the former CEO. Right now, the CEO, as we're speaking, is a guy named Edgar Sandoval. Rich hired Edgar to be the COO of World Vision without really thinking about anything about succession. And 5 years later, when Rich said he was going to be, well, actually, he's 2 years later when he said he was going to be done in 3 years, the board started a search. And because World Vision's over $1 billion organization, they got some
mhm,
really heavy hitter corporate types who were interested in the job. But they included Rich in the evaluation. They included him in the job description. When he saw the first draft of the job description, he said, "No, no, this needs to be completely rewritten." And the board was respectful enough of him and his success. He had been there for 20 years that they invited him in. They said, "Okay, yeah, yeah, you come on in." And he said, "I want to bring the HR person with me and have her be involved in the process too." And they said, "Fine, that's great." He rewrote the job description. When the search firm narrowed it down to 4 or 5 final candidates, they invited Rich and the HR person to come to the location where they were bringing the candidates for their final interviews and let Rich and the HR VP do interviews of these candidates. Rich became convinced during the interviews that none of these people is the right person. The right
mm,
person is Edgar Sandoval, the COO that I hired at that point 5 years ago because of the culture fit. Rich himself came from the corporate world. He describes it as when I got to World Vision, it was like landing on Mars. I didn't know, I didn't know how to breathe. I didn't know they expected me to be a spiritual leader. Somebody came up to me the first week and said, "What's God's vision? What's He given you as a vision for the future World Vision?" He said, "I don't even know where the men's room is." And, and he said, "I don't have a vision. We'll work that out together. That's a discernment process for us all to do together." But he said it was just so hard to get used to what the culture of a Christian nonprofit was compared to his corporate experience. He had been the CEO of multiple other corporations. And so he began to feel that there was a high possibility of failure from these external candidates who didn't really know World Vision.
mm,
One of the questions they asked was, how do you feel about the idea that you're going to be going to some of the most desperately poor places in the world, and a mother will put a starving baby in your arms? And he said most of these people said, "Oh, that's okay. I think I can handle that." Rich's own answer when he was asked that years earlier was, "I think I'm going to fall to pieces. I don't know how I'm going to handle that. My wife would do better at it than I would.
mhm,
She's tougher than I am." And so, anyway, he advocated for Edgar. The board hired Edgar. Edgar's been in that job now for about 5 years. He's been
wow.
phenomenally successful. The organization's gone from 1 billion to 1.4 billion after having been flat for a few years there at the end of Rich's tenure. I've seen another one. I'll just tell a quick story. that I personally was involved in. There's an organization called True Face, and it was founded by three guys, one of whom was the CEO, Bruce McNichol. I became friends with him. My wife and I became donors. It's a teaching ministry, content ministry around God's grace in our lives and how we grow as Christians. Very effective, some really good books, like the book The Cure is one of their flagship books. Anyway, Bruce was looking for years for a CEO, and they had just a hard time finding the right person. Then they found Robbie Angle, who was the discipleship pastor at at Andy Stanley's church,
Hmm.
and and Robbie was young, like 30s, and had 8 kids at home, and and so I didn't know Robbie at all. Now by now I've been a donor for 10 or 15 years. I'm good friends with Bruce, and I asked him, I don't know, Robbie, why should I keep giving to True Face? And Bruce gave me a great, compelling speech about how their best years are ahead of them. Robbie is absolutely God's man. We've prayed and searched, and we finally found the right person. And I, my wife and I, that year we gave our usual gift, and we continue to give and still give to this day. And in fact, I just agreed to go on the board. Robbie's been after me
Oh, wow.
for 5 years to join the board. And the here's the sweet part of the story. So Bruce didn't really want to continue on working anymore, and he had to. He did what he could to help transition the donor relationships to Robbie, and then he went away. I think maybe it was a year or so that he was not involved. And then some international opportunities started to open up where other countries wanted this content. They wanted someone to come and teach them how to teach how to disciple people in this particular way that they use. And Robbie thought I can't be traveling overseas with 8 kids at home, leaving my wife with 8 kids. So
Hmm.
I mean, these are 8 kids that are all at home. And he called Bruce and said, Bruce, would you be willing to go? I can't remember what the first one was, Cameroon or something like that. Would you be willing to go and do this event that they're holding? And they want us to be the speaker. And Bruce prayed about it with his wife, and they decided to go. And then he's gone to multiple countries since. So that ministry is now having an international outreach because of the relationship between Bruce and Robbie, and how Bruce felt honored and kept in the family, so to speak, such that he was willing to come back and basically work for Robbie and take a piece of responsibility that Robbie felt that Bruce was the only person that could handle, and he himself couldn't do it.
Wow. Well, Steve, I appreciate you telling those stories to give us a vivid picture and experience of what it looks like when transition doesn't exactly go so well, and then when it works out in a phenomenal way. Steve, in your experience, just to set the table, there are thousands of baby boomers retiring every single day, and it's only going to increase in 2026. Um, what have you seen when a founder kind of overstays their welcome? What is that dynamic like?
Yeah, that's ugly. Um, a founder often expresses the desire to move on and to groom a successor. I've seen founders go through 4 or 5 different successors, and they always find something wrong with the person, and that they're just not able to let go. And I sympathize with it very much. You know, as a founder myself, I have just gone through my transition. My successor was named CEO last year. I'm
Mm,
still involved, but I do what he wants me to do. I do the things that are the most important things that he thinks I can do to help him. And it's hard. It is like, it's your identity. I've been doing it for 30 years, and I've built the company, and he wants to do some things differently. And I decided in the transition, we had about a 5 year overlap where I named him COO, and then president, and then CEO. And then I became executive chair. So I'm now technically completely out of the day to day. And except I do things that he asks me to do with individual clients where I have relationships, long-standing relationships, things like that, that are helpful to him. Hardly a week goes by that he doesn't tell me that you just did something that nobody else could do. And it's so helpful for me because I don't have to learned to do that yet. You can teach me how to do that someday.
Mm.
But I recognize that it's hard because early on, as I backed out, I kept letting him take things that he thought he could handle, and I kept thinking, nah, he's not going to be able to do it. I'll have to step back in, and then he would do it, and it would work well. And I felt like for that first year or two, he was exceeding my expectations every single month, taking on more and more responsibility, doing really well at it, had more energy than I had by far, had a respect of all the employees. And I felt like, gosh, this is happening too fast. I wanted to be on like a 5-year timeline, and he's going to be ready in 2 or 3 years. And then what am I going to do? And so there are all those kind of conflicting feelings. There was one time we got sideways and argued, and I felt disrespected. And I called him the next morning and I said, I had a problem with the way you handled this. And he said, okay, first of all, it's really cool that we're talking about this within 24 hours. But next time, don't lose sleep. Call me at 10 o'clock at night. Call me at 11
Mm.
o'clock at night. I don't care. Let's keep really short accounts. So the same thing happened again, like a year later. I felt disrespected. We were at a offsite we were traveling together at a meeting, and we got into a little bit of a tussle in front of another one of our employees. And I called him that night. I remembered what he said. I called his room. It was about 10 o'clock. I said, you told me to call you even at 10 o'clock at night. I I I don't mind if you tell me you think I'm wrong or you get mad at me or whatever, but it felt really disrespectful that you did that in front of another staff person. And he apologized profusely, and I slept fine. And then the next morning, as we got together in the lobby before we went off to our business meeting, he said, "Are we okay?" And I said, "Brian, I slept just fine last night. Yeah, we're okay."
Steve, that account brings up a few different dynamics: grace, forgiveness, and friendship. And so, Steve, in your opinion, are there any other conditions that need to be present for a successful transition? Because what you're talking about, a lot of times it's not just the leadership and the cultural things. It's also the actual, what's the relationship between the predecessor and the successor. And hearing you describe, I mean, being able to call each other, being able to handle conflict, not an if, but when it happens. You just don't always see that modeled. And so, what else existed in your relationship that created the room for success?
I lay out 5 principles in my book, and then I
Hmm.
expound on each of them. And so we've talked about some of them already. The open and honest communication. There's
Hmm.
a good example of that. Humility on the part of everybody.
Mm.
Um, that's essential for things to go well. Respecting the outgoing leader. Brian goes as far as anybody I've ever seen to show me respect and keep verbalizing it and keep in staff meetings talking about, hey, what we're doing today that's working so well has its roots back in what Steve started or
That's
brought with him
good.
from World Vision. He did that today, and we had an all staff meeting every Monday, and today he tied our commitment to using data to drive strategy to what I learned when I was at World Vision in the 1980s. He doesn't have to do that. I mean, the technology we have today has nothing to do with me. He's built it, and his team around him has built it. But he sees this DNA and he's given me credit for it. And so I feel really respected beyond what I would have expected. I was surprised when he did that today. There's a couple other things we talked about, the culture fit, like
Hmm.
those potential World Vision successors who were corporate people, and Rich himself having come from that world, realizing how incredibly hard it was for him to land at World Vision, like landing on Mars. Whereas Edgar Sandoval had come from P&G and had a hard time himself adjusting to the culture, but he had been there 5 years. So everybody knew him and everybody knew that he was a culture fit. So that's a fourth principle. The thing we haven't talked about is the board, the role of the board.
Mm-mm.
And you tell me if you're ready to go there yet, but because I have some thoughts about that. But I would say, using the word you did of friendship, that is really important. And the best predecessor successor relationships are where they truly do become friends.
Mm,
And you don't really realize, I think most young leaders don't realize, and young maybe 40 or 50, but I mean most people that are coming in to take over an organization don't even realize how much it means to an older leader who's moving on or moving into retirement. Maybe they really want to spend time with their grandkids, or maybe they have other things they're going to do. It means so much to them. I've heard several different people, many people tell me he just asks me to lunch every now and then, and that makes a huge difference. He shares his struggles and his victories with me, and it makes me feel so good. Or he calls me once a month, and asks me a question. What would you do about this? And it means the world to me. So little things like that are expressions of friendship and grace and honor, and that helps a lot. I think unless you've been a CEO of an organization, it's not like leaving another job. It's you've been in a very lonely position. You've had ultimate responsibility for whatever it is you've been in charge of. And to walk away from that is a big loss of ego strokes and identity. And so a good predecessor that has a friendly attitude towards you and appreciates what you've done and appreciates what you could still do makes all the difference in the world.
mm. So good, Steve. We did mention the board. That was actually a question that I had for you. Is
Okay.
okay, so hey, the predecessor, successor, we're good. But then there's the board. So how does the that handoff occur with board members kind of getting the same message? Hey, I trust this person. I know them. You all are in good hands, and yet the board is still kind of like, I don't really know how. So how do they smooth that over in the transition, Steve?
Well, the first thing you have to realize is that boards, it is the number one responsibility of the board to pick the CEO, right?
Hmm.
That and probably financial accountability are the two most important responsibilities of a board. The financial accountability happens all the time. You're regularly reviewing financials and reviewing audit reports and things like that if you're on a board. You only get to choose a CEO maybe once every 10, 15 years, 20 years.
Hmm.
A CEO that only lasts 5 years is probably a significant disappointment. So you've got these boards have very little experience at choosing a CEO. Most boards meet 3 times a year for a day and a half, and that's less than 5 days a year that they're thinking about the company, the organization. Maybe they read the board reports and other things that come out, so maybe they've spent a max 10 days a year thinking about the organization, and they only know what the CEO wants them to know for the most part. It filters through the CEO to the board, what they know about the organization. So they really are not, even though it's their most important responsibility, they're not in a good place to make that decision. They don't know
Mm,
what they don't know. And that creates all kinds of problems. Most bad CEO transitions are because the board picked the wrong person. And
mm,
that person either had a arrogance or had a lack of competence, or maybe was a really great person but just wasn't a good fit for the job. So I strongly advocate that boards include the outgoing CEO unless they've been a failure, which then, of course, that's not of any help. But even if the outgoing CEO has been a failure, the board should find senior staff people who have been successful at their jobs and they know the organization way better. If you're in a C level job in an organization, you think about it 365 days a year. You think about it
mm,
even when you're on vacation. It's never
yeah.
completely out of your mind. If nothing else, you're dreaming about, what could be from time to time while you're on vacation. So the person who knows the job the best is the current CEO. That's why I love that story where the board invited Rich to come in and help write the job description at World Vision, and then included him and the HR VP in the final interviews. And ultimately, They let him advocate for the person who was already on the team and chose that person, not because of him alone, but because they all came to the conclusion that he was right. Um, so I had one person tell me when I did about 2 dozen interviews of CEOs, mostly large organizations and some large churches, large senior pastors. And the first interview I did, I told the person I have 4 principles at the time. I hadn't developed the fifth one yet of communication was the fifth one that I added as I did interviews. But the first person I talked to said, well, before I'd even said what any of the four were, he said, first of all, boards are clueless. And I said, well, okay, that's interesting because I have boards don't know what they don't know. And he goes, yeah, that's a nicer way of saying it. And and I quoted him in my first draft of the book, and he asked me to take that out because he said I don't want every board member that ever worked with me to think that I thought they are clueless. He said, but that the boards just don't know what they don't know, and they need the help of people who really understand the organization, which is the senior staff and ideally the outgoing CEO if they've been successful. And so they need to bathe the process in prayer. I
Mm.
had one person tell me that they thought that the successor was so obvious because it was a person who was internally running the organization as a COO. And when the CEO stepped down, they made that person the CEO, and he completely failed. He did a ill-informed merger and just rebranding and blew up the organization. And and the CEO who had groomed him said it was so obvious to all of us that we never prayed about it. And he said, that just haunts me now. Like if we had prayed about it, would the Lord have showed us that there were some defects that we weren't seeing, and that his success was heavily reliant on him working for me and me leading, as the CEO while he was the COO. So I've seen some really healthy, good board prayer discernment, times
Mm-hmm.
where they pray before every meeting, they pray before every interview, they are committed to prayer. The chair of a succession committee should be someone who has a lot of time available to spend in prayer and in digging deeper into the possible candidates. And I think that, if you don't have a really strong internal candidate, then you have to use a recruiting firm. And you want that recruiting firm to be on board with all these principles because they're going to have to help you find the candidates that fit the kind of profile of what we're talking about.
Mm. Wow. So many good stories, Steve, that illustrate so many different principles that are much needed in these times. Steve, as we get ready to close, let's just be honest, succession it can be hard, but it can also work when done well. And so, Steve, what, as a final word of encouragement, what would you say to organizations out there? Maybe it's the predecessor, maybe it's the successor waiting in the wings, but how would you encourage organizations through this process of succession planning?
I would encourage them to take serious the things that we've talked about, the need for really open communication, respecting the outgoing leader, humility on the part of everybody, humility on the part of the board to realize they don't know what they don't know, and to get help from internal people who really understand the organization and who have been successful in their jobs, and to realize that culture fit is such a huge success factor. When I started looking at this, Jason, I estimated about 50% of the successions that I've seen have gone poorly. Maybe not
Mm,
a total disaster, but just not gone well. And and I asked some executive recruiters in the Christian nonprofit space, and I asked others. Everybody guessed 50%. And then doing the research for the book, we discovered a McKinsey study in the corporate world found 47% of CEO successions did not work out. So that was kind of a surprise. And then after the book was written, Harvard has just done a study that estimated that 50% of executive transitions at all levels in organizations don't go well.
Wow.
And I would say that when you hire from within, the success rate's probably 70%, and when you hire from outside, it's probably 30%, and it averages
Mm.
out to 50. But that I guess would be my last sort of admonition is plan ahead, start working on this years ahead, and try to groom a successor from within, and work on two or three people if you have two or three candidates, and mentor them to see who emerges as the best leader and the best fit. And you're much more likely than also to have a friend because you've mentored the person, and they're much less likely than to disrespect the outgoing leader.
Steve, you have given pearls of wisdom today that everybody, every organization needs to hear. And Steve, I thank you for that.
Thank you, Jason. It's my pleasure.
Well, folks, you heard it from the man himself, Steve Woodworth. Make sure you go out and get a copy of his book, Lost in Transition: Lessons from the Most Disastrous and Successful Ministry Successions. Steve, where can people go get a copy of the book? Because I'm sure they need it yesterday.
Well, Kingdom Life Publishers is the publisher, and so that'd be my request. People would go to Kingdom Life Publishers to order it. You can also get it on Kindle on Amazon if you prefer that format.
Love it. Well, folks, we'll have all of Steve's information in the show notes, and make sure you go out and then get a copy. And this will make a great gift even for leadership teams. There's a lot of transitions going on across churches, businesses, and nonprofits. So, Steve, greatly appreciate your wisdom in this area, and thank you for hanging out with us here on the Fortified Life podcast.
Thank you, Jason. I've enjoyed it. Appreciate your wise questions and thoughtfulness.
Oh, thank you, sir. Well, folks, that's all we have time for here on the Fortified Life podcast. Remember to like, share, and subscribe to the show at The Fortified Life on our YouTube channel. And make sure you subscribe to The Fortified Life on your podcast platform of choice: Apple, Spotify, iHeartRadio. And you know how we end things. Don't compartmentalize your faith in the marketplace. And from the boardroom to the bathroom, God is with you. We'll see you next time on the Fortified Life podcast.